Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion today. I'm Chris Canty, United Way of New York City board member, and I'm honored to be your moderator for today's webinar, The 11,000 of Vision for Education Equity at the United Way of New York City. At UWNYC, we are committed to advancing education equity and ensuring that every child, regardless of zip code or background, has a real chance to graduate and pursue college or a career. However, right now, our system is leaving behind 11,000 students each year. I'm going to say that again. Our system right now is leaving behind 11,000 students each year. These are young people who are not on track to graduate. That's a crisis. In today's discussion, we'll explore the innovative approaches we're taking to change that trajectory. As many of you know, education equity is a major focus of our work, and it's also at the heart of our Power for Women to Make a Difference Awards luncheon, which is happening on March 11th, just a couple of weeks away. If you want to attend, if you hear something today that inspires you, I encourage you to join us at the luncheon, where we will continue this conversation, celebrate change makers leading the way, and raise crucial support to expand this work. There's still time to get your tickets, and we'd love to see you there. You can visit powerofwomenluncheon.org to learn more. Here now to guide us through today's discussion, I'm excited to introduce our featured presenter, Dr. Liam Lynch, Vice President of Education Equity at the United Way of New York City. Dr. Lynch has worn many hats over 2 decades working with New York City schools and communities. He's been an English teacher, citywide district program leader, education professor, editor-in-chief of the popular Inside Schools website. Dr. Lynch has written dozens of articles and presented internationally on digital learning, school reform, and digital literacies. His applied research on integrating K-12 computer science with English language arts earned Dr. Lynch the National Technology Leadership Award from the National Council of Teachers English. Lynch holds a doctorate in education from Teachers College, Columbia University. Now, before we begin, just a quick note, we'll have some time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions during the session, please drop them in the Q&A box right at the bottom of the Zoom link or the webinar, and we'll get as many as possible answered. With that being said, let's dive in. Tom, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. I appreciate the introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Liam Lynch, and I'm delighted to be here to share with you our vision for education equity at United Way of New York City, which we refer to as the 11,000. So let's jump right on in. When we think about the problem that is facing New York City public schools and communities, we at United Way kind of started looking at it from a bunch of different angles. There's so many different ways that you can sort of, identify what's working and not working in the school system, what has been tried and not tried. But we wanted to make sure to take our time and to really identify what's a unique way into this and to understanding it. And what we did is we ended up kind of fixating on this visualization that you see here and the numbers that it represents. And specifically, each year of the last number of years, there's been roughly 11,000 students who are high school seniors and are not graduating on time, meaning within 4 years. And that number was really important to us as we started making sense of the work that we do and of the myriad issues that are facing schools themselves and communities. And one of the things about this 11,000 number that really started to resonate with us was as follows. So there's approximately 11,000 students who aren't graduating high school, but that number is actually indicative of something else, right? It's indicative of a number of sort of like breakdowns from the moment a child is born to the moment that a child or a young person should be walking across that graduation stage. And so we focus on that 11,000 as kind of like a very visible quantifiable symptom. But we know that throughout the system itself, there's lots of other kinds of issues that are contributing to that. And so for our organization, we kind of look at that 11,000, and we also want to say, like, what has contributed to it, and where can United Way of New York City, like, where can we best plug in? So we wanted to understand as much as we could about the 11,000. And so we started looking at it a few different ways. One, first, like, we started looking at like district level data to understand like what are the percentage of non-graduates in New York City schools by district, and we narrowed in on 2023, and we came up with kind of what you see on this heat map here. Like, there are certain hotspots of school districts where greater numbers of students are not necessarily graduating on time. One of the challenges, though, however, is like in New York City, if you yourself are in New York City, a student in New York City schools, if you're a teacher in New York City schools, or if you're familiar with New York City schools, what you'll know is that there's a pretty robust school admissions process in New York City. And what happens is, for like pre-K and elementary school, students greatly go to school like near where they live, not exclusively, but greatly. As you move through the system, then the distance between home and school often gets greater. And so by high school, you might have students who are living in the northern Bronx and they're going to school, in Brooklyn. So while this data was helpful on a certain level, what it wasn't giving us is a great sense of like these individual 11,000 students, and really trying to understand a little more like who are they. Of course, getting student level data of this type can be quite complicated. So we were working with the public data sets that we had available. So we took another angle into this, and we said, all right, maybe instead of looking at districts, which is an aggregate of schools, like, let's look at the actual schools and see what the school data tells us. So we looked at over 400 high schools, and we said, for 2023, again, like, where are students, this time with raw numbers, like, where are the greatest number of non-graduates in high schools throughout the city? And so what you'll see in this visualization is you'll see all the high schools in New York City kind of visualized, and we're using kind of peaks or spikes to show, which ones are not graduating the greatest number of individual students, again, within 4 years. And this too was illuminating, was helpful in some ways, but there were limits to this as well. One is that geographic kind of question like still remains. So while we do have schools, there's no guarantee that like some of those, that the students who comprise some of those really high spikes, like down in South Brooklyn, the students that those represent are living there necessarily. And the other is that, again, we're kind of looking at, we're looking at like aggregate data at certain schools. If you have schools who are, if you have schools with just like more students enrolled in general, their peaks are going to be higher. So, this was helpful as well, but it wasn't giving us exactly what we were looking for. And so we looked at the data differently then, and we became a bit more focused on this, which was like, if we were to look over time, in this case, between the 7 years between 2016 and 2023, if we were to look at these non-graduates during that time, what were some of the shifts? What were some of the changes in who comprised those 11,000? And this kind of angle into the data gave us some different kinds of insights. Let me walk you through kind of what you're looking at here. So the data are reported according to different categories, right? So we have categories around ethnicity, we have categories around socioeconomic status, and you have categories as well that are around special learning status. And so you have, along the left side there, you're seeing Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white. These are the categories provided in the data sets themselves. We have the socioeconomic data. We actually changed some of the language here to make it just clearer. Poor and not poor is how we labeled it. I think the data refers to like socioeconomically disadvantaged and then not socioeconomically disadvantaged. So for those of you who like double negatives, there's one for you. And then for current ELL, which refers to English language learners, and we have special education students as well. There are multiple categories of English language learners, and we went with current as being the most relevant for this analysis. What we should also say here is that we have the kind of like sometimes when you see like data sets like this and you see these sorts of representations, I just want to make a note that like sometimes it can be like, wow, all of the like sophisticated math that was done to make sense of this. It's like not really actually. Like there was actually relatively straightforward kinds of analyses that could be done here that a well-supported like high school class with Excel could have kind of played around with. And what we found was very illuminating. So over the 7-year period, students who are identified as Asian or white, they did not shift at all in terms of the number of their representation in the percentage of non-graduates. Students who are identified as Black in the city and state data, the percentage who comprise the non-graduates actually went down by 6% over time. Students who are identified as Hispanic increased by 3%. Students who are identified as poor increased by 8% during that time, whereas students who are identified as not poor decreased by 10%. Students who are identified as current English language learners increased by 5%, and students who are identified as special education students increased by 6% during that time. So where we found this really, really interesting. And I'd like to just explain briefly kind of why. And then we'll get into just kind of the practicality of like what this means for our vision, our strategy, all that kind of stuff. But there were a few things that really stood out here. So one is that these categories are not mutually exclusive necessarily. So when you could have a student who is both an English language learner and has special education needs, for instance. So it's important to just remember that when you're looking at the percentages. But the other thing too that really stood out to me and to the team was when we look, for example, at the decrease in non-graduates for students who are identified as Black is decreasing by 6% over that time. What was sort of insightful to me was, during that time period, there were actually a number of initiatives and policies that were put in place within the city to toward that end, including an explicit initiative to recruit Black male teachers. There was an explicit effort as well with city council support to create a Black studies curriculum within 4 New York City schools, which United Way participated in. So, there were actually that decreases. I think there's actually a lot more that could be explored about what led to that decreased number as well. Okay, so if we were to look at just kind of like a high level, kind of where are we at with the numbers? This is sort of the gist of where we landed. There are roughly 11,000 non-graduates. Again, these are high school seniors who aren't graduating in 4 years. And then these are some of the numbers that I just sort of described in terms of the percentages related to that group of 11,000. And what was really kind of heartening as well is when we were doing additional sort of work looking to see what other reports and research had been done out there. We also saw, we found that there was a New York State Comptroller's report in 2022 that complemented the things that we were finding here. We used some different methods of exploring this than they did, but we were arriving at essentially the same conclusions. So we started with with that 11,000 number. Again, remember, it isn't just about that 11,000. We use it as a way to focus our work, but we are well aware that there are a lot of contributing factors from the moment a child's born to the moment they're supposed to be walking across that graduation stage. And we started to then look at the data to help us try to understand the contours of who these students are and how they relate to the current system and policies and the way that they operate. And so it led us toward a vision. So if we start to envision where does United Way go in the coming years, we really see a reduction of 3,000, that number coming down by 3,000 in the coming few years. And we think that's a very realistic goal, actually. And I can explain more about why we think that goal is realistic. But that 11,000 number again as a marker of the health of the system and the efficacy of the system, we believe we can support in bringing that marker down from 11,000 to 8,000. And how are we going to do that? Well, we have an approach that I'd love to share a little bit about with you now. So our approach boils down to investing in research-based educational equity innovations that maximize systemic support to the 11,000. And I'm going to describe in a bit more like what constitutes a research-based, educational equity innovation in just a moment. Before I do want to draw your attention to that word systemic in the title here. So that word systemic is there because there are actually like a number of organizations who do phenomenal work in targeting that 11,000 number kind of directly, right? So you have organizations, for instance, who will provide different kinds of mentorship and support or coaching to high school seniors or juniors to help them graduate on time. You have different programs and efforts, including credit recovery programs that are really meant to help students who are struggling to graduate, get over the finish line and graduate on time. And those efforts are really, really important. What we're interested in is how the system operates from like birth to graduation time, like how the system operates, and where are the gaps that United Way of New York City can perhaps most powerfully, be supportive in filling. And so we have that lens when we're talking about like what are some of these ed equity innovations. And so there's 4 things that we do know from the research, and the research that we're drawing on is both, it's pretty comprehensive. It's looking at educational equity broadly across, national studies, especially. It does lean towards US. We don't do a lot of international kind of reviews. We're looking especially at studies that are focused on urban areas, studies specifically or reports specifically about New York City. And there are kind of 4 things that keep emerging in the research that we think we're especially well positioned to support in the coming years. The first one is around literacy. So we know from the research that literacy is essential for learning. And if I had to summarize, what the research says to a friend, like hanging out the bar with a friend, like what would I say? I'd say the research says to like start early when it comes to literacy, and you have to focus on both like consuming and producing texts. And this is something that's, I think, really important to understand. When we talk about literacy, we mostly talk about it in like the current public discourse. We talk about it in terms of reading and especially foundational reading, which is absolutely essential in a whole host of different ways. The word literacy, though, has also a broader meaning, and it's really important that we acknowledge and try to support and give as much thinking to what happens after a student has kind of foundational reading skills, like what happens next. And that means things like writing, for instance, and the teaching of writing. That's one area that I'll talk about a little later. I think that's probably an area where in the coming years, there's an awful lot of great work that could be done there. But it also means in the 21st century, like literacy as consuming and producing like multimedia texts and computer science and AI. These are all forms of 21st century literacies. So when United Way thinks about literacy, we really take that very comprehensive kind of look at that whole arc of literacy. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The second thing we know from the research is that high quality curriculum and teaching are prerequisites for student success. There's a lot of different ways to define high quality, for sure. But one thing that sometimes the public and even families like aren't always so clear about is when it does come to like the curriculum that's used in a school or the teaching quality, for the most part, that is very much a school and or a district issue. And while there are state support mechanisms and accountability mechanisms in place, an awful lot of the decisions around curriculum quality and teaching are often left to the districts and to the schools. And so what we see in the research, for instance, is that that culturally responsive curriculum has been shown over research studies over time to be more effective for students and often for teacher development as well. And so, when we participated United Way in the as a partner in the creation of a Black Studies curriculum previously, we're actively participating now in the creation of a Latina curriculum as well within 4 New York City public schools, and that's because it's vital that the content and the texts and the questions and the teaching methods are taking into account, students' cultural backgrounds. There was even there was an amazing study, I think in the 80s, around test questions and how there was a test question on an exam where I believe a backyard was referred to and things about that were kind of suburban in nature. And students who were in urban school settings bombed that question and the questions related to it, not because they weren't capable from a literacy perspective of reading necessarily, but because they didn't have the cultural background to understand the cultural knowledge, background knowledge, to understand, what some of these kind of suburban terms were referring to. So really looking at high quality curriculum and teaching, and making sure that, we're seeing what the city's trying to do, what the state is trying to do, and then as United Way, trying to find the best places where we can plug in and support. Number 3, family engagement in their child's learning leads to success in school. There's plenty of research at multiple levels to show this, that in fact, Stanford did a study a number of years ago that was showing that the strongest correlations between a child's success, a student's success on the typical achievement measures like tests and stuff, they were most strongly correlated with the education level of the parent. There's other studies out of Harvard that have shown just how vital it is to really fixate on the quality of the relationship between school and home. And can you build what they refer to as the dual capacity of the adults at school and the adults at home to support the combined needs of the child. And so family engagement is something that, again, I think folks who are in this space will know that there's a lot of phenomenal work that's going on. It also needs more resources. It needs more coordination. It needs more love and support. And so this is a space as well where, where we think that there's a lot of room for innovation. And then finally, schools who serve students in poverty must provide academic and non-academic supports. There's a simple statistic. I don't know if it even qualifies as a statistic, but it's a number that I've shared in different kinds of presentations over the years, which is this: that when you consider roughly that students are in school roughly 180 days a year, and each one of those 180 days, they're in school roughly 6 hours, according to state requirements, let's say, that if you tally that up, it actually amounts to only 12% of the child's life in that year. The other 88% of the child's life, the way that they spend their time when they're not in school, the quality of their sleep, or how safe they feel at home or in their community, those things matter immensely. And so, real holistic responses to trying to support students, especially those who are struggling to graduate on time, it needs to very seriously take into account that other 88%. And so we see this a lot of different ways in the city. So the most formal ways, there are community school models, kind of formal community school models, where you have a school who will very strategically and intentionally partner with other nonprofits or CBOs in the community-based organizations in their community in order to offer a wide array of other kinds of services that might be needed. Health services and screenings, for instance, food distribution, things like that. And so kind of on the not lighter side, but a less formal model version is where you might hear folks refer to as offering wraparound services to students and families. And those wraparound services are, often referred to some of those same individual, kind of offerings, but the model is one where they're very strategically coordinated in an effort versus kind of offering what you can in a little bit more of an a la carte kind of way. All right. So we had those 4 big areas, which I'll just kind of summarize as like literacy, curriculum and teaching, family engagement, and school support. What we also do as a team is we look at all 4 of those, and we really look at how do they relate to the relationship between home and school. And the reason for that is because we know that the more home and school are on the same page, the more that there's healthy communication between those spaces and the adults in those spaces, the more confident the adults in those spaces are in being able to communicate and collaborate with the others. Then, like, the more that that's happening, the better it is for students. And so we look at those innovations kind of with this lens in mind. So if I had to summarize it, like, what are the big 4? Increase literacy access, improve curriculum and teaching, bolster family engagement, and refine school support. That's great, Tom. Thanks so much. That was a wonderful review of literature. Like, but what is it? What's the plan, right? Thank you for asking. The plan is as follows. So we're taking these 4 kind of research-based areas, and we're overlaying those on an innovation portfolio model. And that's where, we then will kind of evaluate results, and we'll look to scale different kinds of successes over time. So if you think of like like your retirement portfolio even, and it's got like a little pie chart, and it's like, here you're invested in like, gold and stocks and bonds or whatever it might be. What we say is like, okay, in that portfolio, we've got these research-based kind of innovation areas that we really want to fixate on. We've chosen these because the research is so compelling in terms of being of value to the population that we're most interested in serving. The innovations are going to come in terms of the kinds of programs then that we offer within there, and how we go about those programs. And that's what I'll share a little bit more of now. So what you're looking at here is we have those 4 research-based areas. And within each of those, we have, I've listed out the programs that are at different stages of development in the ed equity work currently. So you have some programs that have been up and running for a number of years, and we're kind of refining the way that we do that. We do those. You have others that are kind of they're on the design table right now, and like we might be applying for funding, or we might be, piloting something here or there. So they're at different stages. But the goal, as you can see, is to like map the programs that we're offering to these research-based areas, and then really scrutinize and look for like what are the innovations within these program areas that we can really double down on, and we think have a disproportionate there's a disproportionate opportunity for the way that we do this to be able to scale and to do real good. When I say scale too, it doesn't always mean that, like, sometimes it means that we keep growing a program out. Sometimes it means that like we grow it to a certain point, and then we look for ways to scale it with a partnership, or for another organization perhaps to take it on, or for the city to take it on. So what we mean by scale doesn't just mean getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's, we come at it from a little bit of a different angle. So Books from Birth refers to a program where we recruit parents to sign their kids up for free books for between the ages of 0 and 5. I can speak a little bit about what innovation means there. I'll come back to it in a moment. Community libraries is where we identify spaces in communities where families are already kind of spending time, and we try to work with community partners to put libraries up so that we're kind of making literacy opportunities just more available. So, for example, in a laundromat where families might spend hours at a time, we partnered with Laundromat in the South Bronx to like put up a community library in the corner there. And the libraries like bookshelves with books, with beanbags and rug, and we'll be increasing as well kind of our tips and suggestions and supports to families as well. Community rights refers to something that we've kind of got on the design table, and that's where we're looking at the ways in which we can support writing initiatives in schools and really trying to help stretch that literacy arc. Once foundational reading is there, making sure that we have some proofs of concept and we can show, different project-based approaches to teaching writing. The Latin A curriculum refers to our efforts with partners at the Gordon Institute at Teachers College and Hispanic Federation in support with support from the City Council in collaboration with the Department of Education. We're helping design a Latin A curriculum within 4 New York City public schools. It's really based greatly not just on like what the curricular research says, but also we're engaging communities and soliciting student and community input. The Read Write Code Fellows refer to an effort where we wanted to try to increase digital equity by better supporting English language arts teachers in middle and high schools and integrating computer science and AI. Learning with families is one that we're very excited about in the coming year, where we see a real opportunity to help bring together a number of organizations that are serving families in New York City and helping them really build a bit more of a community of practice amongst themselves to coordinate their efforts, to be strategic about the way perhaps that they offer joint programming or things like that. And finally, the United Way of New York City Schools Network refers to what will be a network of schools across elementary, middle, and high school across all 5 boroughs, where we'll be partnering with schools to really try to understand in the first year or two, like what are their needs and what are the unique ways that United Way of New York City might be able to support them in a sustainable way. So again, coming back to that home and school, this is kind of where I would put those programs in terms of leaning towards the home experience of students, leaning towards the school experience of students or teachers. And then like the ones that are in the middle are, again, I think ones that have great promise in unique ways. We don't do this like on our own, of course. So, just to kind of like zoom out and remember earlier, I was like, we have this 11,000, we want to get it down to 8,000. The reason I was saying that with some confidence is because the United Way we don't intend to do this alone. We intend to really coordinate, the kinds of efforts that we undertake with other organizations that are happening in the space and with a critical, timely awareness of kind of what's going on at the state level, the city level, and then, we kind of position ourselves there to then say like, okay, who are the organizations who are doing some interesting work and what are ways that we might be able to partner with them? And these are just some of the organizations that we've partnered with in recent years. As you know, education is very much a state issue. There is federal funding that comes to states for education, but when it comes to how anything from the federal level is kind of interpreted or acted upon, the state and the districts are the ones ultimately who do that. And so, we've kind of limited the visualization here to starting at the state level and then going down to the city schools and then down to us. Impact. So when we think about impact, we think about the ways that we use both macro and micro data to define what impact looks like. I've been working in and with New York City Public Schools for many, many years, a couple decades. I was an education professor for a number of years. I was on the ed policy side a bit more explicitly previously. There are lots of ways to make numbers kind of tell the story you want, and we want to avoid that. And so one of the kind of checks and balances we put in place internally is we really think about it in terms of the macro data and the micro data and taking explicit opportunities to try to weave those together. So this is an example that I've shared, kind of from our previous work. We were doing a kind of a tour around New York City last year with a bookmobile going all throughout the city. And at one of the stops in the Bronx, I think it was on Fordham Road, there was a mom I was talking to, and she remarked in passing, like, she's like, we don't have a bookshop in this community. It's easier to find a smoke shop in my neighborhood than a bookshop. And I was really struck by that one little comment. I wrote it down. And then when I got home, I was like how quantitatively true is that? Like, is that like how real is that? So I downloaded the data from the tobacco retailers from the state website, library data as well, bookshop data from the independent bookstore registry, which has changed since. The latest data at the time was, I think, only up to 2019. But I mapped it to try to understand and then discussed it with the team. Like, what do we see here? And what you're seeing in this visualization is like all of the brown dots are registered, are registered to sell tobacco. These are stores that can sell tobacco. The blue dots are the libraries. And then at the time, I believe there's one or two more at this point, but at the time there was one official bookstore in the Bronx. Even the Barnes & Noble that was in the Northeast Bronx had closed up shop. So it's in this spirit that we think about impact. It's not just relying on the big macro data, and it's not just relying on like the quotes and the qualitative data that we might get from from surveys and stuff. We really try to put those two in dialogue, and we really try to ensure that we're seeing as clear a picture as possible by mixing what researchers would say by taking a little bit more of a mixed methods approach. When it comes to the way we actually do the work, a little behind the curtain kinds of stuff, like on the team, we kind of have this motto that like data or it didn't happen. And we take all of these different programs and we map them to objectives and key results. And we try to ensure that in the key results that we're using, that in those that we try to mix, that's where we really try to mix the data up. So are we getting high level macro data? Are we getting micro data and like surveys and quotes, and how do those all work together? And then based on the ways in which we kind of evaluate the different programs, like we'll see which ones are working, we'll tweak, and then the ones that have promise, we'll attempt to continue to fundraise for and to scale. Now, what will success look like? If we do this right, then this is what our visualization should look like. This is what our chart should look like. In 2028, we should see that there is this kind of uptick that's leading to 3,000 more graduates in that time span. And there's some other kind of pieces at play. This assumes that the enrollment levels in the school system like stays level, though it's been declining recently. So, but this is but we imagine we foresee 3,000 more graduates. So in closing, for my part, we don't know what the future is going to look like, but we do know who's going to create it. And those 11,000 students are going to help shape the future of the city. And so education equity requires innovation. And that's something that at United Way of New York City, we're hoping to be able to support and to help realize. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to hand it back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Tom, for that amazing presentation. The work that you and your team at the United Way of New York City is truly inspiring. Now, let's take a moment to address a few questions. We'll get to the audience questions, but Tom, I did have a question that I wanted to ask you because you mentioned the content, the text, and the teaching methods having to take into account the cultural backgrounds of the students. What are some of the ways that the United Way of New York City are trying to support teachers in making sure that they can connect with students in ways that resonate with the actual learners?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. I appreciate it. Let me actually answer that question from an authentic place of experience for myself too. So when I was in elementary school, I remember studying, we were studying the presidents, right? And I got really excited because we were talking about John F. Kennedy. And I came from an Irish house. My dad's from Ireland. My grandmother had a picture of Kennedy up, in the living room, okay, next to the Pope. And I remember in the classroom being so interested in the presidency because John F. Kennedy's his name sounded like my name. And I had, uncles and friends who had the last name, let's say Kennedy. There was a certain level of familiarity. And in that moment, I remember wanting to be president. And there was no reason why I didn't think I could. And what I've reflected upon in doing this work is that not only did I relate as a handsome, smart, 8-year-old, okay, with Kennedy, with the president, but the books we were reading were often written by authors also with similar names, experiences, and pictures, complexions as mine. And so were the characters. So what I think is really helpful sometimes for folks to consider when we talk about culturally responsive curriculum is that, speaking for myself, the curriculum I experienced was culturally responsive to my experience and identity and family background. It's really important for students to have those kinds of experiences in classrooms. And there's a whole host of different ways that that can be done. I taught English, as you know. So for an average English teacher, you might pause and say, like, what are the texts I'm teaching in this class? Who wrote them and whose stories are they telling? And if I'm responsible as a teacher for this list of standards and skills that I need to teach my students so they can do well on this test later on, if that's kind of my reality, I can teach those skills and standards through Shakespeare. I could teach those through Toni Morrison. I can teach those a whole host of different ways. So what books am I choosing and why? And so there are subtle moves like on the curricular side, like what texts are you using? In a math context, you might create questions like math questions that are situated in, in a New York City community kind of scenario, as opposed to taking whatever you found on the internet and copy and pasting something about selling lemonade, at the park or something. Like there's a lot of different sorts of like examples and subtle moves. And I think it's something that in the coming, certainly in the coming weeks and months, there's only going to be more discussion around like, what do we actually mean by this? What is it? Why is it important? And what do we do in terms of realizing this in city schools and classrooms?
Thank you, Tom. Let's take this question from the audience. Have you considered that some students, notably newcomer immigrant students, actually need 5 or 6 years to graduate? Is that included in the data set when we talk about the 11,000 students that don't graduate each year?
That's a really, really great question. We've deliberated that 4 years versus 6 years pretty deeply here. There are lots of other organizations who will provide 6 years as the window for graduation for some of the reasons that the person asking the question that they're aware of. Like some students do require additional time, and so we respect that. We also believe that our responsibility as an org is to look at the whole system and to say, like, is the system doing what the system is supposed to do for the majority of students? Like, is it working? And when we look at high school, like high school is set up, it's organized, its tests are at a cadence to promote, its funding is all set it's supposed to work in 4 years. Like high school is supposed to do what high school is supposed to do in 4 years. And so if a significant number of students are not graduating in the 4 years, and not all of those students are English language learners, not all of those students have special education needs. Like if that tells us that there's something that's amiss here. And so we pretty intentionally focus on 4 years, and we honor the fact that there are other scenarios where 6 years might be important. But because we're focused on is the system working or not, we say it's got to be about 4 years, because otherwise what can happen, and I've seen this happen in policy conversations, is that too many stakeholders get comfortable with the 6-year graduation mark. 6 years should be sufficient for those students who really need it. But like we do not do victory laps if like on the 6-year number, just because we're hitting, because more students are graduating than before. It's like, well, you've given an extra 2 years, and we have to be careful with that. It has to be limited to the students who really need it. And the system itself still needs to hold itself accountable for that 4-year window. And so that's where we landed. It might not be a perfect stance, but it was an intentional one.
Thank you for the answer, Tom. I want to take this other question from our audience. How can community-based organizations and faith-based organizations partner with the UWNYC to support one or more of these pathways to change outcomes for New York City students and families?
I love that question. I'll be honest, the first kind of big step that we've taken was to kind of reimagine, especially post-COVID, like how is United Way of New York City doing the work that we're doing? And are we structuring it in a way that that encourages and opens up space for these kinds of partnerships, so that community-based organizations and other partners can like plug in a way Because what can be a challenge is if you do this work in a way where it's just kind of discrete, here's a program, here's a program, here's a program, then you get those partnerships and they're kind of plugged into a single program that isn't part of a larger strategy, and then it becomes harder to sustain and to scale that work eventually. So what we've done here is we've tried to make sure that with these 4 research-based areas and with some of the programs that we've started to outline, that we're creating a structure that is really built for bringing on new partnerships and being able to to sustain and scale those kinds of partnerships. For folks who are interested in working with us, step 1 would be watch this webinar and sign up for it. So well done there, so that you can get a sense of of what some of the possibilities are. The what I would say too is if this is something that you feel like, well, they're doing work that we think we can contribute to. I think a good intermediary step between having that epiphany and then emailing me or the team or contacting us through our website, which are all ways to get in touch with us. I think it's always helpful as well to pause and to say, are there other orgs that my organization works with, or that has an affinity with? Are there other orgs who might also we might be able to come to propose a partnership together? And that's I think a really powerful step in terms of making partnerships work. So I would encourage folks who are interested in partnering with us to probably contacting us through the website is the easiest way to do it. I know there'll be a follow-up email as well where we can provide the contact information needed. And the more that interested organizations can also kind of coordinate and strategize amongst themselves and kind of come with a collective idea or proposals, those are especially exciting, and usually for me usually makes me pause and be like, oh wow, what is this possibility here?
Tom, you mentioned during your presentation that you were, during the planning part, when you were laying it out, you said that the United Way of New York City will have a school of networks that it selects to work with in order to gain more information and see how the changes, the programming that you implement is actually making an impact. I'm curious, how do you go about the selection process for those schools?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. So one is we've been working with 5 schools in Mott Haven, 5 elementary schools for the last number of years. And we see those schools as kind of foundational to that schools network that I'm describing. If our vision is around this 11,000 number, and we treat that 11,000 as a marker of an entire system that needs support, then we also need to make sure that we have not just elementary school and not just one borough, but we also have representation across the city. And so we've been strategizing that now. There's different approaches to it. One is to go to school districts directly. That can be, it seems straightforward. It can actually be really challenging because school districts have an enormous amount of responsibility. And just to put it in context, if you're tuning in from a suburb, your school superintendent might have, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 schools that they're ultimately responsible for. And it's not uncommon for superintendents in the city to have 24, if not more. So it's a Herculean task that superintendents have. We've been exploring as well, kind of talking directly with the New York City, the central offices, who aren't exactly the same, not exactly the same team as the superintendents. There are also some really unique organizations in New York City who kind of straddle some lines. The 2 that are most stand out to me over the years have been New Visions for Public Schools and the Urban Assembly. Both of these organizations, they are nonprofits who have a portfolio of dozens of schools that they work with, almost as a supplement to the school district. And those organizations have very close relationships with the school districts and with the city. So we're looking at all of those different options, and we haven't fully landed on how we're going to do that yet, but we're getting close.
Tom, when it comes to the 4-prong approach that UWNYC is using for education equity, what will the UWNYC's rollout look like? Would it be training community partners or shifting to support those who already do work in the space, or a combination of both?
Yeah. So it's going to vary per program. So remember on that one slide, there were like 7 programs named, and then it was like brackets, and it was like, this is part of, this research-based area. This is literacy, this is curriculum and teaching, et cetera. The approach is going to it's going to differ depending on a few things. So one is we have to look at the level of significant funding requirements for some of these to take them from where they're at now, whether it's the design table or we've piloted stuff or we've been doing it for a while, like how much in funding do we need to take it to whatever that next level is? And in some cases, we can do things, quite innovative at relatively low cost to us. I can give you an example. In the case of Books from Birth, where we recruit families, throughout the city in order to register their children to receive a free book, every month for between the ages of 0 and 5. In the past, we've done that by kind of putting flyers up with different kinds of community partners and whatever it might be. But there are other ways too that we can be a bit more like strategic and targeted. So, for example, what would it mean to partner with like churches for recruitment or partner with pantries for recruitment as well? We even look at it from like the innovation front. We even look at it in terms of like if we were to really streamline registration so that it was like a flyer with a QR code. And if the QR code gave us kind of visibility into how many folks were signing up from these different partners, then it would give us a real sense of like, it would give us some real insight into the demand in different settings, and we can really tweak and toggle that and kind of scale it if necessary, if desired over time. We can do that kind of thing, Chris, for relatively little money. Like we have a team where, it's really about some infrastructural shifts. On the other end of the spectrum, if we want to launch something like Learning with Families, what we would really envision for that is bringing together, 10 to 12 nonprofits who are serving families in different ways throughout the city and really providing them with grants or with stipends to participate in something like a collective. That takes more money, just that part alone. And then we would likely need some additional, internal staff to like kind of manage some of that. So how we go about it really depends on the program. It depends on our capacity at a given moment with the responsibilities that we have. And then, of course, it depends on like the funds available for us to be able to move at different paces.
Tom, we're going to take one more question for the audience because we're running short on time. So the last question from our audience: are you looking at retention rates from year to year in the school programs offered to students that have the highest retention rates throughout their 4 years in high school? And what are some of the lessons that you can glean from them?
So just so I'm going to interpret that question, I guess, like if it's about when you say programs, I think it depends on what that means. What we have looked at is, and there's actually quite a bit of research around this in terms of school design and school models. Like what are the different models of schooling that are most effective for retaining students and then for supporting students, and that can even be broken down by students with different kinds of needs. What we have seen for sure is that there's one is that there tends to be relatively lower teacher and staff turnover in schools that are really supporting students and getting them to graduation. We've seen as well that there's often greater stability and higher quality in the curriculum that's offered at the schools that teachers are providing, whether the teachers are designing it themselves or they're getting it from somewhere else. It can vary. And we've seen as well that like the role of the parent coordinator, which many schools have, not all, is kind of this like linchpin. I'll use that word with my last name in mind. It's like kind of like there's this linchpin role at schools, which is the official person who's responsible for really creating those relationships with families and communicating that back with schools. And those roles are often immensely underappreciated and underfunded. And in some of the standout schools that we've seen with kind of really impressive results, they almost always have either a really strong parent coordinator or there's another mechanism they've created to have really tight, deliberate, strategic relationships with families.
Well, Tom, that is an amazing presentation. And I still have a ton of questions, but we have to be respectful of everybody's time. So I want to thank you for taking the time to put together this webinar and to put together this presentation. It is absolutely awesome. Thanks again for sharing your expertise and your vision with us today. I also want to thank everyone for joining us and engaging in the critical conversation. This webinar was recorded, and we will be sending out the recording to all registrants so you can revisit today's discussion and share it with others. We encourage you to do that because the work is very important. And before we sign off, I want to remind you once again about the Power of Women to Make a Difference Awards luncheon on March 11th. If today's conversation has inspired you, there's still time to be a part of the movement. Visit powerofwomenluncheon.org to learn more and secure your spot. Thank you all again for joining, and we look forward to continuing this important work together. Have a great day.